Or you can do mobile gaming on here? That's cool. Sick gaming stream. Playing Clash of Clans. Hello, Tariq. Hello, good game. How's everybody doing? David, Stokazoni, Chonk Patrol. What is up? What is up, peoples? Viewers? Hey, can I ask you a question? Of course. When are we finally abolishing the value form? Probably long after we're all dead. I have a date in an hour. Oh my goodness, congratulations. Good luck. Good luck. Make sure you talk to them about Marxism. That's what all girls want to hear. Man, it's so nice out. It is so nice out. Love your videos. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how long some of you have been following me, but do any of you remember when I posted my original John Fetterman videos? Was Marx an alcoholic? He wasn't an alcoholic. He liked to drink, though. Ingalls was more of like the partier, honestly. Probably because he grew up in a bourgeois family. His dad was a factory owner. He had more wealth. Marx was pretty poor. Him and Engels would like party together, but neither of them would probably be considered alcoholics. Why are you so cold? It's kind of cold outside where I'm at in Iowa. Yeah. That's on the New York Post. Not great. Not a great outlet. Purple looks good on you. Thank you. That was my college wrestling themed colors. That's why I've got this hat. You're the GOAT. I love your content. Thank you. Thank you. What was I saying? But did any of you follow me when I made the original John Fetterman videos? Like making fun of John Fetterman for pretending to be a working class person by wearing a Carhartt. I'm like, this guy graduated from like Harvard, right? My alarm just went off. He's not a working class person, right? He's a career politician. And his staffers, these Democratic Party staffers and aides and campaign managers who, I worked with the Bernie campaign. I've worked with these people. They dressed him up in a Carhartt in order to make people think that he's working class. Because working class people like to wear Carhartt sweaters. And I basically made a TikTok joking, like, I'm John Fetterman and I support endless money to Ukraine and I don't support Medicare for all or universal health care or doing anything for the working people, but I'm wearing a Carhartt sweater, so vote for me. That makes me working class. And that was when he was running against Dr. Oz in the primary in Pennsylvania, and I got attacked, not just by like Democrats and libs of TikTok, but like by socialists and progressives and people who are like, normally I like your content, bro, but leave Fetterman alone. Fetterman standing up for the working class. There were hundreds of comments and Stitch videos being like, Eddie, how could you use your platform so irresponsibly to attack John Fetterman? Erie says, yeah, you've always called out Fetterman. Thank you, yes. So many of his staffers just left. Good. Thank you, Erie, for recognizing that I've always called out Fetterman. Because, it was pretty vicious how hard people attacked me. One guy, I'll never forget it. One guy was like, Eddie, John Fetterman's my neighbor, and you shouldn't be attacking him. I'm like, well, I don't care that he's your neighbor. He's corrupt. He supports endless war and imperialism. And now that John Fetterman's in office, all he talks about is being pro-Israel. All he talks about is being pro-proxy war in Ukraine. And he just tweeted today that he's grateful for the veterans who fought for our freedom in the Vietnam War, right? A war against Vietnam, who never attacked us, who never invaded us, who never threatened us, where we unalived over 2 million people, devastated their infrastructure, their agriculture, their soil, their forests, devastated the whole landscape with Agent Orange and napalm. And that's just Vietnam. It was really a war in all of Indochina, or what was called then French Indochina, because we carpet bombed Laos in secret while the government lied to the American public and said they weren't engaged in Laos. And we carpet bombed Cambodia, where Henry Kissinger told U.S. pilots to bomb anything that flies or moves. So that's what John Fetterman's celebrating today. And, I just want to take a moment to be like, not I told you so, but yeah, I did tell you so. All you people who attacked me for criticizing Fetterman. This is why I was criticizing Fetterman. Because he's a Zionist, because he's an imperialist, because he's a career politician who graduated from Harvard. He's one of them. As George Carlin said, it's a big club and you're not in it. And John Fetterman is in the club. He's in the rich, corrupt politician club. And the fact that he put on a Carhartt sweater was apparently enough to convince a lot of people that he's not, which is really frustrating. Fetterman loves Israel so much, it's crazy. John is a joke, can't say he didn't fool me. Well, and that's that. If you're willing to admit it, I don't mean to say I told you so and rub it in. Because, I can do that and I can be all mad that people attacked me, for criticizing Fetterman from the outset. Right, but it makes sense. He's a liar. He did try and trick a lot of people. And, I would rather people who were tricked by him, be more skeptical of politicians and be more critical of politicians and less willing to jump on the bandwagon with politicians going forward. All right, so it's not really me saying I told you so, right? The point of this is me saying this is an example. Thank you, Zed, for the bunny ear. Oh, thank you. Yeehaw. Thank you, Regal. It's me saying don't trust politicians. Be skeptical of politicians, especially ones who graduated from Harvard and have never worked a real job in their life. Like John Fetterman. Fetterman serves his donors, not his constituents. Yes, like most politicians. China had to remove mines to build trains in Laos. Yeah, Laos still is covered in bombs that didn't detonate from the U.S. bombing campaign. Thank you, Zed, for the TikTok hat. Laos is, and Obama spent a bunch of money, too, to try and clean those up as basically an apology to Laos for carpet bombing them and leaving their countryside riddled with bombs, because these bombs will detonate sometimes and hit civilians and farmers. So, yeah, and Laos is still a Marxist-Leninist country. They're still a socialist communist country to this day. So the U.S. war failed, as is Vietnam. Thank you, Crow. Thank you, Zed. Still waiting for that debate with Mute the Media? Dude, I haven't seen that guy in forever. I would totally debate Mute the Media. Didn't he make a video once talking about how Russian sanctions were good? In response to one of my videos about how the sanctions on Russia were bad and only going to hurt working class people. And I was right about that, but it ended up backfiring on the West. Really what the Russian sanctions have done have hurt Europe and hurt the U.S. in various ways, but especially Europe, because they used to buy so much oil and natural gas from Russia. And they really haven't affected Russia. Russia's economy has continued to thrive. And they've showed that they're not dependent on the West and these European economies to stabilize themselves. They'll just trade with China and more countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia and, and with countries who we used to call, or who we refer to as being in the global South or the formerly colonized world. Debate Fetterman, I wish. But yeah, either way, Mute the Media's idea that sanctions on Russia are good. Or sanctions on Iran are good. No. No. Imperialism isn't good when it's directed at a country that you don't really like. Sanctions on Iran only hurt the Iranian people. They've done nothing to overthrow the Iranian regime. And to be honest, the only reason the U.S. likes the Iranian regime, or dislikes the Iranian regime, isn't because they're dictatorial or they have theocratic elements, or because they have something against Khomeini. It's because 70% of Iran's banks and industry are in the hands of the state, which means 70% of them are government owned, which means they're not owned by Western multinational corporations and accessible to Western capital. So that's why the U.S. hates Iran. It has everything to do with economics. The U.S. never hates these countries for the reasons that they tell you. It's never because we need to bring them freedom and democracy. It's because we want their oil. Can you debate Prax Ben? I have. I'd rather debate someone less dumb, to put it nicely, as possible. Ben has also, like, repeatedly doxed me now, right? He made that video recently, like, Eddie tweeted out that I have small D energy, but he didn't give the context for why I tweeted that. I tweeted that when he was organizing a campaign of people to call my job and try and get me fired. Thank you, John. And then when he got called out on it and called out on doxing me, thank you, Crow, he said, it is a moral obligation to dox Eddie. Like telling people it's a moral obligation to share my job or my place of employment, my address and phone number online. So that's what, then I said he has small D energy, and then he makes a TikTok like, what is Eddie talking about? He came out of nowhere and said I have small D energy. Like, no, motherfucker, you were sending emails to my employer to try and get me fired. You stupid idiot. I run a private wrestling club now, and Prax Ben and his buddies were emailing my private wrestling club trying to get me fired. And guess who runs the email account for that private wrestling club? Me. I do. So they were sending emails to me demanding that I fire myself. And you want me to debate this guy? I'm good. I am good. Communism is Jewish. Just shut up. You're so dumb. It's so dumb. There's no evidence for that. Everything you guys blame on the giant cabal of Jewish people that you imagined in your heads is just capitalism. Right? Bankers all do the same thing. They all try and trap us in debt and charge us interest and exploit us. Doesn't matter what ethnicity or religion or what group they come from. They could be frickin' purple from the planet Mars. And if they own a bank under this current capitalist system, they're going to try and trap you in debt and exploit you. It has nothing to do with some kind of Jewish conspiracy. Like, not only is that the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and not only does that distract us from what's really important, which is fighting against capitalism, but it also makes the pro-Palestinian movement look bad. Because the Zionists call everything anti-Semitism, right? You criticize Israel, that's anti-Semitic. Say you're pro-Palestine, that's anti-Semitic. You criticize AIPAC's influence on the government, anti-Semitic. It's not, but then when you have these people running around who are actually anti-Semitic, you make us look bad. You allow the Zionists to point and go, look, see, I told you they're anti-Semites. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you for the roses. Thank you, Aram Grace. Thank you, all the Val. My therapist said she's meeting with Fetterman soon, defends his voting, and claims socialism. I'm confused. Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Sarabi. Thank you for the follow, Dreamer. One anti-communist said that half the people in the DPRK are starving. How's that even possible? Thank you, Crow. Thank you, Floppy One. Yeah, I don't know how that would be possible if half their people are starving. That's like Gaza numbers. That's Gaza under this blockade and bombing campaign. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, guys. Yeah, they're approaching famine. Thank you, this dude. Appreciate it. Gaza and the million children living there are approaching famine. Meanwhile, we have our president's meeting at Radio City Music Hall in New York to do a fundraiser. It was Obama, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden. And guess who did an intro song for them? Lizzo. They had Lizzo do their opening concert. I'm surprised Israel didn't try and take Lizzo and drop her on Gaza. Thank you, Aram Grace. Thank you, Floppy. Like, isn't it wild that people are starving because of the U.S. government? Children are starving because of the U.S. government. Every single day. Every single minute that passes, they get closer to famine and starvation. and the president is sitting at a Lizzo concert in Radio City Music Hall asking Americans for more money after he just sent $14.5 billion to Israel and another $60 billion to Ukraine. He's asking us for more money to run his campaign. Listening to a Lizzo concert. Thank you, Dr. Sick. It's just wild. That Lizzo joke was wild, bro. Yeah, I had to throw that one in there. Thank you, DRS. What would America look like if the government embraced communism, in your opinion? Well, immediately, like, there needs to be... Thank you, FP. Like, we're working on doing a lot of things behind the scenes to really build a strong working-class communist party in this country. And if you want to be a part of that, join the Midwestern Marks Discord, link in my bio. But anyways, the Communist Party needs to have a long-term plan, and they need to have a short-term plan. They need to have a long-term plan of what we want to do, which is transition towards a society where all the whole economy is controlled and dominated by the working class, where there's no exploitation, and where, everybody has access to what they need. But that kind of society needs to be built, and it needs to be built out of the current society that we have now. So what would be done in America tomorrow, I think you would have to see like nationalization of all the healthcare companies, right? Taking the healthcare companies out of the hands of shareholders and making them public, restructuring the entire healthcare system so it's no longer prioritizing profit over public health, which it currently does at every level. You would nationalize the energy companies, like the big oil companies, the big natural gas companies. Nationalize those, and rather than having the profits go towards shareholders, you reinvest the profits in the workers and in infrastructure projects. I think we should enact a jobs guarantee and launch a bunch of programs to rebuild the country's infrastructure. Right, a bunch of like sort of New Deal style programs where we give people jobs building. Because that not only creates a bunch of new jobs, but it also allows us to build stuff like a lot of the state parks and public areas that we have today were built during that New Deal period by jobs that were stimulated by the government, which our government doesn't know how to do anymore. So things like that would be like immediate steps in America, investing in like high-speed rail. And then, of course, withdrawing, the 1,000 foreign military bases that we have, ending the occupation of Iraq, ending our presence in Syria and Libya, dismantling AFRICOM, which is our Africa base that allows us to maintain a very expensive drone war over the entire continent of Africa, alleviating sanctions on Venezuela and Iran and Russia and China. Instead of sanctioning these countries and threatening them and surrounding them with military bases, we trade with them. And we have a foreign policy based on mutual development and cooperation rather than exploitation and subjugation. All right, these would be the immediate steps that a communist government would take in the American empire. Now, those wouldn't be the end-all, be-all. We would continue building a workers' or a society that works for the workers or works for itself. Also, implementing like new forms of worker democracy and popular democracy would be important. Like having something like the Soviet system that they had in the USSR, where there are workers' councils where every workplace like elects someone to speak and make decisions for their workplace. And they meet at like a community level, and then the needs of the community get reported back to the central committee and the federal government or the national government, right? Some way where workers are being handed more control over the economy and over politics. Other than and anything would be better than our system right now, where lobbyists write the bills and corporations donate and dump money into whatever candidate they want to win, and the candidate who wins, or the candidate who raises the most money in this country, wins 92% of the time. So that shows you how thoroughly they can influence elections with money. Sometimes you get an anomaly. Sometimes you get like Donald Trump. But usually they have a lot of money behind them. From like Trump just was able to fund his own campaign, so he didn't need as many wealthy donors. I would vote for you for sure. Thank you. Thank you. Just based on the party platform that I just laid out. I mean, I could run eventually. I don't know. I don't know that electoral politics is going to be our path to change. But I'm definitely going to have a role in this new party that's being built behind the scenes that we're going to be launching soon. And by the way, join the Midwestern Marks Discord if you want to be a part of organizing efforts in America that are in the works, trying to transform this imperialist country into something better. What are your thoughts on how the West declared war against Islam in the Arab world? I have a lot of thoughts on that. That's a great question. I see it as a sort of a qualitative shift. I see the war on terror as sort of a qualitative shift in the disposition of U.S. imperialism. Because before the 1990s, the enemy was communism. It was the Cold War. We need to stop the spread of communism. We need to invade Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and back Pinochet in Chile and do all of these horrible things around the world in order to stop the spread of communism. Communism's the enemy. They're led by the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed and China was moving towards more friendly relations with the U.S., we needed a new boogeyman. We needed a new reason to go around the world and overthrow governments we didn't like and plunder their country of resources. So that became the war on terror. And what do you have in the 1990s? As soon as the Soviet Union collapses, you have the Gulf War. And with the Gulf War, when the bombs were being dropped on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Saddam Hussein was wondering, where's the Soviet Union? How are they allowing this to happen? Why aren't they blocking this? Because the Soviet Union provided sort of an umbrella of protection over much of the so-called Third World, where the U.S. knew they couldn't be too brazen in their regime change efforts or bombing campaigns, or the Soviet Union would get involved and fight back. Right? But as the Soviet Union is collapsing, they launched the Gulf War and basically bomb Iraq to a pre-industrial or post-apocalyptic state before leaving them under sanctions, which killed an estimated 500,000 children, which Madeleine Albright later said was worth it on 60 Minutes, quite famously. So the Soviet Union collapses, and immediately you have the U.S. getting involved in the Muslim world. And soon after that, you have them saying that we're fighting this war on terror. We're fighting a war on terrorism, which obviously 9/11 would kick that into high gear. It would give the U.S. justification to invade Iraq and to invade Afghanistan. We've been occupying those countries ever since, except Afghanistan we recently withdrew. And look at all the regime change efforts since the 90s. A lot of them have been focused in the Middle East. Not all of them. There have been lots of regime change efforts in Africa and Latin America. But we've been targeting Iran. We've had the war in Libya. We've had the war in Syria. So a lot of it's been in the Muslim world, in North Africa and the so-called Middle East and West Asia. And it's all sort of been lumped together as a war on terror. We're fighting terrorism. When, ironically, it was the U.S. that revived jihadist extremism and terrorism in the Middle East when they dumped millions and millions and millions of dollars and a bunch of arms into Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan was trying to put a Marxist democratic government in power with the help of the Soviet Union. And the U.S., in order to combat that, armed up Osama bin Laden, and the Mujahideen would then splinter into Al-Qaeda, into the ETIM. You know, it would influence and lead to the rise of groups like ISIS. Thank you, Jordan, for the hand hearts. Thank you very much. So the U.S. did everything they could to stoke jihadist extremism, and they did the same exact thing. Obama's administration did the same exact thing in Libya and Syria, arming, funding, propping up, and giving advice to and doing propaganda for jihadist extremist groups trying to overthrow the government. And then we claim that we're in these areas to fight extremism. It's so fucked. It's like our government is arming the extremists and then invading these countries, apparently, to fight extremism. It's unreal. Thank you, G. Thank you, Muhammad. So yeah, that's what I think of the war on terror. It's a propaganda tool. And there's a lot of oil in the Middle East and a lot of resources and a lot of people's labor who they'd like to exploit. Thank you for the hand heart, Floppy. Flabe Flabe. Thank you, Flabe. Wasn't the USSR's attempt to invade Afghanistan in the 80s just as bad as the US's attempt now? Absolutely not. You can criticize the Soviet Union's idea to get involved, especially because it eventually failed and the government was eventually toppled by the US-backed jihadists, which allowed Afghanistan to be taken over by the Taliban. Thank you, Jordan. But that's what the Soviet Union was trying to prevent. They were trying to help this Marxist democratic government stabilize things, while the U.S. was trying to help jihadist religious extremists establish a caliphate, establish a theocracy. And, you know, like, this is the kind of stuff that was going on. The Soviet Union and this Marxist democratic government in Afghanistan were going to the rural areas of Afghanistan and teaching people to read, especially women who hadn't been allowed to read for years because of religious fundamentalists in charge of the government and lack of industrialization. So they had literacy workers going all over the country teaching people to read, and the U.S. would pay extremists who would throw acid on their faces. Many who would hide out in Pakistan and then come over the borders to attack the social workers and the literacy workers who were backed by the Soviet Union and the Marxist democratic government. So the Soviets, you know, were trying to prop up this government that would teach people to read, while the U.S. was propping up a government of jihadist extremists who would throw acid on the faces of the literacy workers. And many people in Afghanistan today, and Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad wrote about this in their new book, The Withdrawal. Many people in Afghanistan today talk about the period where the Soviet Union was there as the most hopeful time in their country's history, because hospitals were being built, schools were being built. Thank you for the roses. You know, it wasn't perfect, but they were making efforts to change things. They were making efforts to move in a socially progressive direction in terms of the education of women and stuff, and in an economically progressive direction. They wanted to industrialize Afghanistan and alleviate the poverty. But the U.S. dumped money and guns into the jihadist extremist groups, especially in the rural regions of Afghanistan, and they were eventually able to topple the government, and the Soviet Union had to leave and go deal with things at home. So it was really just a disaster, but to equate what the Soviet Union did to what the U.S. did is really just not accurate. So there's that. Could you explain how the Russia-Ukraine war is and how the Western media presents it to be? Yeah, I've got a lot of videos about that on my YouTube channel, Midwestern Marks, but it's basically a Western proxy war. NATO promised Russia that they would stop expanding towards their borders in the 90s. They didn't. They dismantled Yugoslavia in order to continue expanding eastward towards Russia's borders. Russia continuously said Ukraine is a red line. You know, we see Ukraine as being, you know, almost part of Russia, especially eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region, where most of the people are culturally Russian and speak Russian. And if you know, make Ukraine a NATO vassal state, the same way you did with, say, Kosovo, which was carved out of Serbia, then, you know, we're going to do something. We're going to invade. And they didn't end up adding Ukraine to NATO, but there was a coup in 2014 backed by the United States that put a very pro-NATO government in power and overthrew a more pro-Russian government, or a government that wanted peace with Russia. The U.S. orchestrated a coup in 2014 that also allowed a lot of right-wing Ukrainian extremists to gain positions of power in the Ukrainian government, and especially the Ukrainian military, groups like the Azov Battalion. Did a coup in 2014, and this ignited a civil war in Ukraine where the extremists, the right-wing Ukrainian nationalists, began shelling and destroying the Russian speakers in the Donbass region, the eastern part of Ukraine. So the Donbass region requested that Russia intervene in the civil war to help them 10 times, and Russia said no because they didn't want to anger the West. But as the West continued to support the corrupt Ukrainian government leading this civil war against their own people, led by literal Nazis against the Russian speakers in the East, NATO was continuing to train troops there. They were continuing to establish a presence. There were also other signs of U.S. presence in Ukraine that I don't know if I can talk about right now without getting banned, because People say it's a conspiracy theory, but it's not. Anyways, NATO continued to develop or build troop presence in there, building up military force right on Russia's borders. And then Russia eventually launched the special military operation to push Ukraine out of the Donbass. And there was a peace agreement on the table where Russia would have got Crimea and the Donbass, right? They basically would have got the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine that actually voted in a referendum to join Russia, which is not surprising. Like I said, most of the people there are culturally Russian. They speak Russian. They see themselves as being part of Russia, whereas people in Western Ukraine are more likely to be like Ukrainian nationalists. So the peace agreement would have allowed Russia to just take these eastern parts of Ukraine that voted to become part of Russia, and Ukraine would have got the rest. It was a very friendly deal towards Ukraine based on the military superiority that Russia has to Ukraine. They didn't need to offer, terms that were so agreeable, but they did because they wanted to bring an end to the bloodshed and bring an end to the war. And guess what? NATO and the United States and Great Britain sent Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the UK, to break up the peace agreement, to make sure that we didn't have peace. And he told Zelensky, no, you can't appease Putin, right? Finding peace or moving towards peace so people are no longer getting slaughtered every day and Ukraine is no longer being pummeled into dust by artillery, that would be appeasing Putin. So we can't sign this peace agreement. We have to keep fighting him to the last Ukrainian, which really gives away the game, right? Because what the U.S. says they want is peace. They say Putin's this violent maniac who attacked Ukraine for no reason, which we know isn't true. As I just explained, there were plenty of reasons why Putin launched the SMO. Plenty of reasons that the U.S. and NATO created and gave him. But the Western media says he's just this crazy man, and we in the U.S. want peace and freedom. Right? But there was a peace deal on the table. We could have had peace. Zelensky wanted to agree to this peace deal, but NATO said no. We want to keep using you as a pawn. We want to keep using you as a proxy to take out as many Russians as we can, to hurt Putin as much as we can, because we view Russia as an existential threat. And NATO said that themselves at a summit, that Russia and China are their number one enemies going forward. It was like in 2017 that they had that summit. So this is really Russia responding to an insane amount of NATO aggression. And, the U.S. pushing for geopolitical dominance in every way, right? They want complete geopolitical hegemony. And even though Russia is not a communist country anymore, even though they're not socialist and building socialism and speaking out against U.S. imperialism at every turn, just the fact that they've gone against what the U.S. wanted a little bit in nationalizing some of their oil, in trading with Europe, in developing their economy rather than allowing themselves to be a colony of Western corporations. Because they've done that, the U.S. has tried to destroy them and labeled them as their number one enemy. And now Russia's sick of it. And what we're realizing in Ukraine is that NATO and the Western Empire is not as invincible as they make themselves out to be, or as they've been made out to be in the past. Right now we have a country striking back against NATO expansion, and they're winning. And, the Western media is now forced to admit, finally, that Ukraine isn't winning the war. And I've been talking about, the original question was, can you debunk the myths about the Ukraine war as it's portrayed in the Western media? And that would be the last myth that I would want to debunk, is that Ukraine is winning, right? I debunked the myth that there was no need for Putin to go in, that he wasn't provoked, that it was an unprovoked intervention. I debunked the myth that the U.S. is pushing for peace while Putin is just, pushing for more war. And the last myth is this myth that Ukraine is winning. In fact, Ukraine and NATO have been running out of arms for a while. Ukraine is a much smaller country than Russia. Russia's been waging this war of attrition, where they basically grind Ukraine down little by little. And now, there are reports out of Ukraine that they have to conscript 40-year-old men, because all the young men have already been sent to war and have been captured or sadly have lost their lives. And that shows how tragic this is. An entire generation of Ukrainians is being wiped out for NATO's proxy war, when we could have had a peace agreement 2 years ago. And there are also these horrific videos of the Ukrainian SBG, the Ukrainian intelligence, which is basically their version of the CIA, grabbing people off the streets in vans, right, and kidnapping them and taking them off to the front line to go fight in the war because they're running out of troops. And this is why Zelensky, wanted a peace agreement, because he recognized that the writing was on the wall and that Ukraine was going to lose, and his people are getting tired of fighting this unwinnable proxy war. So he wanted the peace agreement, but NATO told him no, and Zelensky's nothing but a US and NATO puppet who's allowing his own country to be destroyed and ground down to nothing at the behest of NATO and the US empire. And it's really sad. It's a really tragic situation. But to just completely fault Russia and fault Putin and ignore the U.S. role in creating this conflict is really silly and stupid. And I've said that from the beginning, and that's gotten me attacked. That's gotten my account banned. Big accounts like Good Morning Bad News and Ryan Beard have called me a Putin simp or like a Putin puppet, a puppet of Russia for pointing these obvious things out, just for pointing out that Putin was provoked, that he didn't just wake up and do this one day, that he did it because NATO was expanding towards his borders and threatening him and creating a civil war in Ukraine. So, yeah, but it's true. I don't care, though. They were wrong. I was right, and everybody can see it now. Sorry, Ryan. You should have read a book. Your accent is so interesting. Thank you. In no way will Ukraine win. Russia's playing the slow game because Zelensky can't send out his youngs. Yeah, Russia is playing the slow game. They've been doing that for a while. It's been a standstill of people saying, when is Russia? I couldn't take it. I don't understand. They're winning. 2 years later, they haven't taken a third of the country. That's not their goal, though. Their goal was never to take the entire country. I've been saying this from the beginning. Their goal was never to march into Kiev and topple Zelensky and his regime. The goal was to stabilize the Donbass and do what they call denazification. What was the other word? I can't remember. But they wanted to bring an end to the civil war in the Donbass, where these right-wing extremists like the Azov Battalion were shelling people's homes. And that's largely been done. But the goal was never to do this lightning quick either. Do you know what a war of attrition is? Do you know what... I've said this multiple times, and apparently it didn't sink into your thick skull. What I said, or what they're doing, is playing the long game, because they know that Ukraine doesn't have the manpower or the arms to keep up with them and wage this war of attrition. So they're playing the long game rather than just rushing in and potentially risking more Russian soldiers and more Russian lives than they have to. They're just going to grind Ukraine down slowly. And that's why it's taken 2 years. But Russia is achieving all of their military objectives, and even the U.S. media is forced to admit this now. There are even, many articles worried about what's happening with the war in Ukraine. They made it seem like the Ukrainian counteroffensive was going to be this big win for Ukraine, where they pushed back Russia and destroyed the Russian defenses, and that didn't happen. They were repelled at every single attempt. They got nowhere with the counteroffensive. It was a massive failure. And then Russia just went right back to playing the long game after they beat the Ukrainian counteroffensive and grinding them down to a halt. So I don't know what kind of brainworms MSNBC has put into some of your ears, into some of your minds, but you need to kick them out and start looking at the world for what it is. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, your mom. The world isn't a comic book where Vladimir Putin's the bad guy and Joe Biden's the good guy. Things are a lot more complicated than that. I visited Russia as a U.S. citizen. They treated me better than U.S. border control. Or border patrol. That's funny. There's a lot of things about Russia that are superior to the United States. A lot of people saw that when Tucker Carlson went. And just, the liberals melted down Because Tucker showed how things are cheaper at a Russian grocery store than here, but all that has to do with, it all has to do with their economy moving more towards central economic planning rather than just, free market rule of corporations. Putin is a Yahtzee? I wouldn't say he's a Yahtzee. I would say he's a Russian nationalist, which is what he claims to be. A Yahtzee is a very specific thing. A lot of the people in the Azov battalion in Ukraine, they're literally Yahtzees. They have the Yahtzee symbol, that famous square-looking symbol, that symbol that looks like some spokes. Right? They'll have that tattooed on themselves, and they see themselves as the descendants of Stefan Bandera, who collaborated with the German government to commit a lot of horrific massacres and acts of ethnic cleansing during World War II. So that's what a Yahtzee is, right? Putin's not that. Putin is a Russian nationalist. Thank you, your mom. And I mean, you could say he's a dictator and stuff, but his ideology is not Yahtzeeism. Who you got? Raleigh versus Pitbull tonight. I didn't even know that was going down. I joined the Discord. I hope we can discuss my earlier confusing comment in there. Cool, thanks for joining. Be sure to join the Discord. Bro, you have been completely brainwashed. By who, Maya? By who? Who brainwashed me? I'm repeating an alternative narrative to MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of these mainstream media outlets who have been saying that Ukraine is winning the war since day one and have been proven wrong time and time again since day one. But you don't think you're brainwashed? You don't think you're brainwashed by all of the corporate media in the United States who's saying the same exact thing in unison? You don't think they're brainwashing you? It's me, who reads independent journalists and who looks to sources outside of the U.S. and who looks to scholarly sources about this issue from academics like Ivan Kachanovsky, who wrote, who's done incredible research about the 2014 coup that was orchestrated by the U.S. in Ukraine. Right? It's me who's brainwashed. You get brainwashed by reading independent sources and going outside of corporate media. If you believe everything MSNBC and the New York Times tell you, you got it all figured out, though. They won't brainwash you. Come on. Let's not be silly. America's the most propagandized country in the world. Everybody outside of the West, outside of West Europe, and the U.S. knows what I'm saying is true. Every single person in Latin America and Africa knows that NATO provoked the war with Russia. Right? None of them believe this MSNBC narrative that Putin just invaded one day because he got a stick up his ass. That doesn't make sense, you guys. That's not how geopolitics work. Thank you, your mom. Leaders don't just get angry one day and decide to invade. There's material interests, there's geopolitical interests, there's security interests. And these need to be discussed. And discussing these doesn't mean you're brainwashed by Putin propaganda. It just means you're willing to live in reality, not the fantasy world that's been invented by MSNBC and the liberal galaxy brain. Thank you, your mom. You're a modern day hero, bro. Thank you, Tyson. Thank you, Liminal. Thank you, AMK. There's a distinct lack of critical thinking. There is. There is. Please talk about Syria. What about it? The U.S.-backed war? Do you read any fiction for fun? Sometimes, not a whole lot. I just... Reading is exhausting on the brain. Reading nonfiction can be exhausting on the brain. So usually to relax, I don't read fiction. But sometimes. I read Ghassan Kanafani's Men in the Sun this year. But Syria, I mean, the so-called Syrian civil war was a U.S. orchestrated war, NATO-led intervention. Even from the beginning, we were dumping money into extremist groups and our preferred groups in the region, anti-Assad groups, to try and destabilize the country because we wanted their oil wealth and among other resources. But If you look at the places where the U.S. and NATO are occupying in Syria right now, it's right where the oil drills are. It's right where the oil fields are. So we actually went in and occupied that part to guard the oil. But we wanted regime change. We wanted the overthrow of Assad. So we backed the so-called Free Syrian Army, which was a group that was allied with ISIS and Jaish al-Islam and other jihadist extremist groups who the U.S. supported, and Israel, I should say, supported indirectly. And then Russia eventually intervened on behalf of Assad and really swung the war in his favor, and allowed the Syrian government to defeat the U.S.-backed forces, which included a lot of extremists. But now the war is basically over in Syria. Things have calmed down. There's, the U.S. is still occupying the oil fields. There's still like skirmishes that go on, but for the most part, Assad and the Syrian government won. Assad and Putin killed 600,000 people. Yeah, it's a block. Anytime somebody doesn't engage with the arguments you're making and just does death count economics, right? Like, I'll mention that Israel took the lives of 30,000 Palestinians and 10,000 children, but I'll also explain the context about it, right? I'll explain that Palestine is occupied territory, that the West Bank and Gaza are occupied, that most of the people in Gaza are refugees who were pushed out of other parts of Palestine by the Israeli ethnic cleansing operation and by the Nakba. I'll explain that Israel's bombing their own occupied territory, that they have these people trapped in a ghetto and an open-air prison, and they're just bombing them repeatedly. So I won't just give those statistics without any context, but people who think communism's evil, or who think Russia is a comic, or the world works like a comic book villain and Russia are the bad guys, they'll just be like, 600,000 bajillion million dead. Communism killed 600 million bajillion thousand. And it's like, are you counting everybody who tripped and fell down their stairs? Are you counting everybody who got in a car accident in the Soviet Union as a death of communism? Like, what the hell are we even talking about here? When I say 30,000 Palestinians have lost their lives in Gaza, I mean people who have been either shot by the IDF, by tanks or artillery, or who have been hit by missile strikes. And these missiles are, paid for by the U.S., and Israel has disproportionate military power compared to the Palestinians who don't have the backing of Western imperialist powers and who don't have high-tech weaponry. All right, I can explain the context around the statistic of 30,000 people dead or 13,000 children. The people who cite the Black Book of Communism can't. They just go, 1 million bajillion dead. How can you support 1 million bajillion dead? Putin and Stalin together killed 100 million bajillion Ukrainians. How can you support that? And it's like, you're just saying a big number and acting like it's an argument. Opinion of people who claim to be ex-communists, they're usually people like Thomas Sowell who just sold out. Hey, Tanky. Are sovereign states allowed to join NATO? I would argue that the capitalist states aren't sovereign. They're owned by mega corporations. People don't actually have any control over their governments. Also, the U.S. had to launch the NATO bombing campaign in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia or Serbia, along with a whole bunch of other efforts by the IMF and World Bank and the U.S. State Department to infiltrate and destroy what remained of the socialist economy in Yugoslavia. Then they had to carpet bomb Serbia in order to carve Kosovo out of it and station more NATO troops there than any other place on Earth. Right? So these aren't sovereign states. NATO has expanded by dismantling sovereign states, by dismantling democracy, by balkanizing Yugoslavia into like 6 different countries and then carpet bombing Serbia. So they would agree to further balkanization and the carving out of Kosovo, which is basically a NATO base in East Europe. And then in 2014, you have the coup in Ukraine, and there was also a coup in Georgia. Right? And the idea is to make these countries more pro-Western, to install governments And there's a really good movie on YouTube called The Color Revolution Doctrine by our friends at the Revolution Report, if you want to know more about this. But there have been all these color revolutions and coups with the idea of putting in power a more pro-NATO, a more pro-Western government. We've seen that in Georgia, we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Yugoslavia with a full-on regime change effort. So it's not like sovereign states are just joining NATO. It's U.S. puppet states are joining NATO, and if they don't, they get overthrown and replaced with a U.S. puppet government. So that argument's really stupid. Eddie, how are you different from a MAGA conservative at this point? Because I advocate for universal health care. I advocate for the oil companies to be made public and the healthcare system to be made public and worker-owned. I advocate for implementing more worker democracy. I advocate for bringing all the troops home and ending all of America's foreign wars. I advocate for alleviating sanctions on Venezuela. I advocate for investing in infrastructure and investing in education and having more jobs here in America. Focused on building things and construction rather than all of our government revenue, which currently goes towards destruction and endless wars abroad. So if that's what you think a MAGA conservative supports, then sure, call me a MAGA conservative. I don't really give a shit what you call it. I would call it communism. I would call it Marxism-Leninism. I would call it socialism. But if you think building a society that takes care of people and meets their basic needs and is focused on human flourishing rather than the accumulation of surplus value and the making of more profits, if you call that MAGA conservatism, then fine. I don't really care. I think you're pretty stupid, but you can call it whatever you want. Sweden definitely is a U.S. puppet state, yeah. Who's mocking the idea that the Scandinavian countries are essentially U.S. puppet states when it comes to foreign policy. They're not U.S. puppet states, but they all had troops in Iraq. Somehow. Thank you, Tyra. Thank you for sharing. Gabriel, I haven't seen you in forever. Probably because I always get banned, Gabriel. Thank you for following, though. Be sure to follow me on X or follow me on YouTube or any of the links in my link tree. Join the Midwestern Marks Discord. That's the best way to do it. That's the best way to do it. I love how you think you have any idea about Scandinavian politics. I love how you think you have any idea about politics in general. You just called communism MAGA conservatism. So you don't really have a leg to stand on here, Mr. Mashups. And what is what I said about Scandinavian politics wrong? That the Scandinavian countries were involved in the Iraq War and they sent troops to help occupy Iraq? Google it if you think I'm wrong. Also, the Scandinavian countries during COVID blocked ventilators to Venezuela and Cuba. They helped the U.S. enforce sanctions, and they do this, all around because they're part of the U.S.-dominated global financial system, which is what makes them, in many ways, puppet states of the U.S. They're dominated by the IMF, World Bank, and these banks that are based out of Wall Street in London, which much of the world is subservient to this international banking system that emerged, especially post-World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant hegemonic global superpower, but these Scandinavian countries also help with imperialism by enforcing the sanctions. So when Venezuela was trying to buy ventilators during COVID, the Scandinavian banks, I think they were Swedish banks, accepted like 95% of Venezuela's payment, then wouldn't accept the last 5%. So they took Venezuela's money for the ventilators, but then wouldn't let them finish paying so that Venezuela couldn't get ventilators that they needed to take care of people who were dying during COVID. Right? That's what these wonderful Scandinavian social democracies have done around the world at the behest of the U.S. And they did the exact same thing to Cuba when the U.S. asked them to. So yes, in many ways they are U.S. puppet states and they are arms of U.S. imperialism. And no, that doesn't make me a MAGA conservative to say that. It makes me a Marxist-Leninist who recognizes that social democracy is not the answer. That social democratic countries in Europe and Scandinavia still serve U.S. imperialism and still help them keep a boot on countries in the global south like Venezuela and Cuba. No, they didn't. That's a lie. Sanctions exclude medical equipment. Don't lie. You're the one who's lying. The U.S. says that the sanctions exclude medical equipment, but many studies have been done, and they have found that the sanctions don't exclude medical equipment, that they are preventing medical supplies, vital medical supplies, from getting to Cuba. For example, Cuba developed their own COVID vaccine during COVID, but they couldn't give it out because syringes were blocked by the blockade. And Cuba's a small island country, so they couldn't mine the resources they needed to make syringes. So that's just one of many ways in which the sanctions affect Cuban healthcare and Venezuelan healthcare. Also, look up what I'm talking about. These Scandinavian banks did block payments for the ventilators. So that's another example that you're wrong. The sanctions do block medical equipment. Just because John Bolton and Anthony Blinken and the architects of the sanctions say, no, these don't block medical equipment, doesn't make it true. Every study in the world that's been done on the sanctions, including the recent UN special report in Venezuela that found that the sanctions have decreased their government revenue 99%, have found that it's really, really hurting the healthcare system and stopping them from getting medical supplies. So maybe go on Google Scholar and search the things that you're talking about before you speak confidently about them by repeating John Bolton's fucking talking points like a moron. Jeez, we have some dumbasses in the chat today. Like, what is going on? Biden is sleepy Trump 2024. Couldn't agree. Dudes in the comments, best arguments be nuh-uh. Yeah, I went into a long explanation of the Syrian civil war a while back, and a girl goes, Putin and Assad killed 600,000. Oh, good point. Good point. Death count economics. Hey, big fan on everything you are doing, but I want to correct you on something important as a Libyan. Break it down. I'll listen to whatever you say. Just the fact that you're from a country doesn't mean that I'll believe that you're right, but I'll definitely hear you out. Keep fighting the good fight. Absolutely. Is Biden going to win a second term? No, I think Trump will probably win. I think people are pretty much sick of Biden. We've had 4 years of him now, and he hasn't been any better than Trump, so. Yet death count seems to be people's only argument for why Palestine is being genocide. You're so stupid. That was literally the example that I gave. I said, in Palestine, I do read the death count statistic, but then I give context to it. I explained that the 30,000 people and 13,000 children who have lost their lives are living in occupied territory, where 75% of them are refugees who have been pushed off of other parts of Palestine. That was the example that I gave, dumbass. I said that when I read out these death count statistics, I also give historical context to them. Right? I also explain why 30,000 people have been unalived in Palestine and how it constitutes genocide. And I put it in the context of 75 years of ethnic cleansing. And I said what I'm doing by reading that statistic and putting it in context is different than what people do when they just repeat the Black Book of Communism and say 100 million dead. Like, how hard is it for you to grasp very basic arguments? I am not used to dealing with this many liberals. I just can't wrap my mind around how stupid you guys are. Socialism is the only way forward. You bet. I genuinely think Mr. Mashup is cognitively impaired. No one's that dense. I think a lot of these liberals might be. Or they're bots, or they just watch way too much MSNBC. Yo, bro, they didn't lose their lives. Their lives were taken. I'm sorry. I'm literally just saying that because TikTok won't let me say words pertaining to losing life. I say they lost their lives because I'm not allowed to say they were the K word. So I have to say they were unalived by Israel. It's part of TikTok's stupid guidelines. I'm trying to have my live not get deboosted and suppressed by TikTok for talking about violent things. So I get what you're saying, but it has everything to do with TikTok's guidelines and nothing to do with me. I learned quite a bit from you. Thank you. Thanks. It's infantilizing for sure. It is. It's super dumb. And they also suppress any of my videos talking about the right-wingers during World War II. You know, those right-wingers in Italy, Spain, and Germany during World War II, the right-wing leaders. If I talk about them, the videos get suppressed even though I'm criticizing them. It's super infantilizing. Like, we can talk about the Austrian painter who was the leader of Germany during World War II without supporting that guy, right? And we should be allowed to criticize him and explain how he was backed by the big banks, and how the big banks and Western corporations financed the Holocaust. Great recipes. Thank you. Have you ever actually voted? I have voted. I vote every year. I don't know why I shouldn't. Or do you prefer to cosplay as a revolutionary? How much change have you enacted by voting there, Alex? How much change have you enacted by voting versus how much change has been enacted by class struggle? Right? How many actual material gains were gained by the John Deere workers in the Midwest who went on strike, right? Because it's not all about revolution, right? Revolution is the goal. Political revolution is the goal. But Marxism is about class struggle, right? And saying that the only way that we can advance our material conditions and better our conditions as workers is through class struggle. So say union organizing, right? And the unions, through organizing and going on strike or threatening strike, especially in the last 4 years, have done a hell of a lot more than Joe Biden has done for them, or than what Joe Biden has given to them. Right? So you're voting for a bourgeois candidate. You're voting for a candidate who's cucked by the ruling class, who's nothing but a puppet of his corporate donors and lobbyists. You're voting for him over and over again every 4 years, like, oh, I hope something will change soon. I hope this one won't be corrupt this time. And you keep voting for these corrupt guys over and over and over again, rather than saying, fuck this electoral system where we have to vote for two candidates who are owned by corporate America. Let's organize workplaces, let's organize communities and actually fight for ourselves. Actually stand up for ourselves, actually threaten to collectively withhold our labor as workers so we can bring the ruling class to their knees and make them do what we want. Let's engage in class struggle, not just vote in the bourgeois elections every year. So if you think that is cosplaying as a revolutionary, if you think it's cosplaying as a revolutionary to educate people about class struggle and tell them to organize their workplaces, because that's going to do a hell of a lot more than voting for whatever candidate you're sucking off this year, then sure. I prefer to cosplay as a revolutionary, because union organizing actually gets shit done. Unlike Joe Biden and whatever bourgeois candidate you're trying to shame us and make us feel bad for not voting for this time. Every 4 years, it's the same shit. Oh, the other guy's so evil. We have to vote for him or we're all fascists. Everyone who doesn't vote for Biden's a fascist. Oh, yeah, I have to vote for Genocide Joe, the dude who pushed Gaza into a famine, otherwise I'm a fascist? Fuck you. I'm sorry, I'm a little angry today, but these liberals and like I can't wrap my brain around how you think this way. You got to be so damn stupid. Thank you for speaking up. You bet, Cass. Thank you for sharing the live, Kevin. Oh, my one face or two face, one coin. Exactly, themes guy. I'm glad you get it. Working class people get it. It's just libs who spend all day on MSNBC. You should feel bad for not voting. Yes. Well, guess what, Alex? I don't. I truly don't. I'm going to go vote third party this year. I'm not going to vote for Biden, and I'll think of you while I'm voting third party. Just kidding. I won't think of you ever again. And I hope none of my audience feels bad for not voting for Biden either. Thank you. I'm going to vote for D's. D's nuts. Right wing, left wing, same colonial bird. Facts. Spittin', Abu. Vote De La Cruz. Voting Cornel West. Yeah, vote for one of them. Vote for PSL. Vote for Claudia De La Cruz. Will you think of me ever? Of course, Turtles. I think of you every day. Biden is done. I will never vote for the Dems again. Based. Love to hear it. Love to hear it. All right, y'all. I got to go charge my iPad. I'm almost out of battery. I will upload this to youtube.com/ oops, I have to verify. I'll upload this to youtube.com/MidwesternMarks. Join the Midwestern Marks Discord. Link trees in my bio. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Sorry I got so angry at all the lips today.